Welcome to Real Estate Focus. I'm Kelvin Law. The topic is commercial real estate law. With me here today is David Lebwith. He is the owner of the law office of David Lebwith. Attorney Lebwith has 25 years of experience as a real estate attorney who specializes in residential and commercial real estate laws. And he is here today to share with us in terms of what is real estate law and what is involved and what you need to be aware of when it comes to owning properties or leasing properties. But having said that, welcome, David.
Calvin, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being here and thank you for sharing. With your experiences, so would you share with the viewers in terms of what type of due diligence should be conducted when buying a real estate commercial property?
Well, a lot of that will depend upon the type of property you're buying. Mm-hmm. If it is something like a gas station that historically has issues of contamination, then you certainly need to have an environmental study done called the 21E. That can be done by hiring a LSP, a licensed site professional, and that person is an engineer and will be able to examine the records of the DEP and also the EPA to determine if there have been any past spills or other issues that could contaminate the property. Similarly, that LSP will investigate neighboring properties to see if there are any issues on either side of the property which might flow into the water underneath the property. Mm-hmm. So environmental is a huge issue, and even if you are not purchasing a gas station, any type of commercial property, you want to make that inquiry for the very simple reason that the law requires, and this is a federal law, that whoever owns a property, when a damage or spill is identified, that person is responsible for it primarily. That person could seek retribution and reimbursement from other people prior to his ownership or her ownership, but the primary responsibility is on the owner at the time. So environmental due diligence is an enormously important aspect regardless of the type of property, because you don't know what has happened in the past on either side of the property and also past usages. Another type of due diligence is zoning. You can hire a zoning attorney to examine the records at the city hall in the building inspector's department to determine if the current use of the property is permitted by law. You're also going to want to determine if the size of the building is permitted by law, and are there any exceptions that the law has allowed, such as called variances. Those are things which are not permitted by law, but the local zoning board of appeals has agreed to allow to exist, or you could create those exceptions. In other words, if a property is zoned for a multifamily, but all of a sudden you want to have a daycare, the zoning board may say a daycare is somewhat consistent with the nature of the neighborhood, and therefore you can have a daycare facility even though it is primarily zoned as a multifamily residential neighborhood. Once you close on a property, you own it, clearly monetarily and ownership-wise, but you also own all the good and the bad if there are any zoning issues, violations, and things like that. Speaking of violations, another type of due diligence is to check to see if there are any building violations on the property, environmental violations as well, but you will be responsible to cure any violations that are on the property, so it makes the most sense to do your due diligence before you close. That way, if there are any violations, you can pass the burden on that to the seller, because the seller should deliver a clear piece of property without any violations, any issues, or any concerns. So you're really looking at environmental, zoning, and building department violations as the three primary areas that you want to focus on. In addition, if there is anything that you hear from neighbors or your real estate broker will identify any things that are heard about or violations that may be happening, may be threatened, those are other things you want to investigate. And probably the last aspect, which is probably the most important, is if you are buying a multifamily commercial property, you want to make sure that all the units that are in that building are legal existing units. You get a lot of people, unfortunately, that will try to create an illegal basement unit or an illegal attic unit, but they won't have allowable egress and ingress in case of a fire. And there have been plenty of matters that have come down where you've had illegal units, and unfortunately there hasn't been sufficient ways to get out in the case of an emergency, and the results have been very tragic. So I know many towns and municipalities are cracking down to make sure that you have all permits, and if there are any illegally existing units, you're required to disband those units or upgrade them to make sure that they are in fact compliant with the zoning laws.
Right. So with regards to any illegal units, I mean, if the buyers would have found any illegal units inside the building, especially multifamily buildings, I mean, can the buyers request the seller to supply them with a permit?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think the primary focus is going to be get a permit, but the permit will have to say that you will use it only as one family. I have a situation right now where we have a building where it is an illegal basement unit, but it's a single family unit, a single family house. So we hopefully are going to get the city to say it's okay to continue using that property as a single family house, but as soon as you rent it out, now you have to retrofit it to be in compliant with current zoning laws, building laws, and you have to have the necessary ingress and egress of the property. Again, God forbid that there's an emergency or a fire.
Right,
okay?
right.
But that is something which you definitely want to have your home inspector and your attorney look into, and even a contractor perhaps, to make sure that you are totally compliant, because the cost to remedy that could be in the 5 figures easily.
Wow. Yeah, that's could be huge.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so.
Right.
Very much so.
And so with something like this, I mean, even before or during or after the transaction, I mean, what are the common contingencies that should be in the contract to protect the buyers?
Well, the first contingency would be the due diligence, as we've just discussed.
Right.
And that would be a period of time that once the purchase and sale agreement is signed, that there's a period of time after that, could be 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, depending upon the nature of it, that the buyer would have an opportunity to examine the books and records of the seller, if they can be provided, or do the due diligence at the EPA or at the City Hall to make a determination, are there any violations or conditions that the buyer does not want to go ahead with unless they are corrected and remedied, which the burden of doing that would fall on the seller. And that is the most basic contingency in a commercial transaction, that due diligence aspect of it. Simultaneously with that contingency running is a finance contingency. Very similar to a finance contingency in a residential transaction.
Right.
It is time for you to apply for your loan, get approved, satisfy your conditions. Those are the 2 primary types of contingencies that people should really worry about when they're looking to purchase a transaction, a commercial property. The other thing that you may want to include as a contingency is an examination of the seller's books and records. If you're buying an ongoing business that's part of a piece of commercial real estate, you're going to want to see what has the seller done business-wise, dollars and cents, to make sure that is it in fact the business you think you're getting, and are you going to be able to maintain the current business, or if not, can you exceed it? And if it's going to be less, is that going to be sufficient to get a loan? Because you have to have enough income coming in order to satisfy the bank so you can pay your mortgage every single month.
Right.
So that's another aspect of it. If you are buying a multifamily property, you're going to want to examine all the leases, tenant at will agreements, or security deposits to make sure you know exactly what you're getting. Because the last thing you want is to move in and a tenant to say, I didn't agree to pay that amount of rent.
Right.
So you want to get copies of leases, tenant at will agreements. You may even want to have your tenant sign something called the tenant estoppel agreement. And that document is the tenant identifying how much their rent is, how much the security is, how much their last month's rent on deposit is, and what is the last payment they've made, and are they in arrears. And that would be something the tenant signs, the landlord would countersign to make sure that you know exactly what you are getting when you acquire your property, so there are no surprises. The last thing you want is to have a tenant say when their lease is up, I have X thousands of dollars in deposit, I want my money, and the buyer says, wait a second, I don't have that, I never got that, I have no proof of that, and the tenant says, here's my proof. So you failed on a couple levels. You failed your due diligence requirements, you've also failed as a good buyer, because you should be looking at every single aspect that affects your ownership of that property.
Right.
Okay.
I agree. And so everything should be in writing instead of like verbal agreement or something like that. So.
Everything should be in writing. Keep in mind, if in a traditional tenant at will agreement, and you can have tenant at will agreements in multifamily properties, obviously, you can also have tenant at will agreements as a commercial tenant. It could be a verbal month-to-month agreement, or once a lease is expired, you might have a continuing obligation to pay rent, maintain property as a landlord, for a particular period of time until either tenant or landlord wants it terminated. But with commercial property, you obviously want to have everything in writing. And if you're buying a property and you've got verbal agreements or expired leases, residential or commercial, you really want to insist that you get final agreements in writing so everybody is fully protected, everybody goes into a transaction or an ownership with your eyes completely wide open so there are no surprises at all, because that's the last thing you want, is to get a situation where you're not prepared monetarily or even emotionally, because a problem like that takes a big toll out of somebody who's trying to maintain a property.
Right. And also when it comes to like big piece of property, I mean, it comes to numbers, expenses, finances, I mean, you can name it basically.
Yes,
so,
yes.
And you're going to be on the hook for everything after you close the property. So due diligence is very important at the beginning and also during the transaction as well.
Yes, sir.
And having a good attorney, that would help as well.
Having a good attorney is important, is very important, and not equally, almost important, and is having a good real estate broker.
Yeah.
Because if you have a good real estate broker who is experienced in that area of the transaction, they're going to know not only what to look for, but once they see something, they're going to have an extra sense, a gut reaction that's going to say, that doesn't seem exactly right. Or giving a piece of paper, maybe I should ask for the next step. So if you have a real estate attorney who's not that experienced, but you have a broker that is very experienced, oftentimes the two will react very well together, where one will feed on the experience of the other.
Right. Just like everything else, I mean, including residential transactions. I mean, everyone has to work as a team.
Correct.
Because, when it comes to problems, I mean, it could get complicated.
Yes.
And it takes a concerted effort to get those resolved.
Yes.
And so that's why it is important to work with good professionals to protect your best interests, if you will. A lot of times, I mean, I've seen cases where it takes some common sense, to catch a problem. So therefore, make sure that the real estate agent is, or the attorney is competent, experienced, and also intelligent as well in each transaction.
And one of the due diligence contingency is actually part of your finance contingency in terms of getting clear title. Now, a title contingency is usually not a separate contingency. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But you want to make sure that there are no other easements or other encumbrances or limitations on your use of the property that could affect you at a later date. You may have a seller who doesn't quite care that the neighbors cross over their yard to pull their garbage pails in front of their building. But you might care because you might want to do something in that area where they're not going to be able to pull their garbage pails.
Right.
Now that's something which you will determine by talking to the neighbors, something by having your broker talk to the people in the neighborhood, but also by physically visiting the property and seeing at different times of the day what's happening, who's doing what. And that's something which is very, very important. You really need to make sure what the title shows is an easement recorded, and if an easement is not recorded, nothing is recorded, you want to examine the usage of the property on an every now and then basis to know that there's nothing else going on that's going to negatively affect or could negatively affect your usage of the property or your tenants' usage of the property. Because if you have unhappy tenants, you're not going to have tenants that pay you, and as a result, you're going to have a problem.
Right. And then it creates other legal issues too.
Yes, sir.
So
yes,
right,
yes,
right. So when it comes to finances, I mean, I know for a fact that commercial is a little bit complicated than residential, if you will.
Yes.
Because it involves with high down payment and also high risks as well.
Yes.
So when it comes to financing or loan, I mean. What is a commercial loan different than a residential loan? I know that you're not a mortgage expert, but just share a general idea of what is between and how complicated it is.
Well, the biggest difference with a commercial loan is the bank wants to see where you're getting the money to pay the debt. With a residential loan, you earn an income, you have a job.
Right.
With a commercial transaction, yes, you're obviously going to have a job, and that job may be maintaining the properties.
Right.
But what is the cash flow coming off of that property? If you're owning a building that's got a couple of stores, what does the rent roll look like? What are the expenses? Typically, you have to provide an income and expense statement to determine what is the amount of cash coming in on a monthly basis, on an annual basis, and the banks will typically have a percentage and a formula to say, yes, this is good this is a good cash flow situation, and therefore it meets the ratios, the debt to income ratios on a commercial transaction, that the bank will want to give you a loan. Now, in a residential transaction, you have roughly the same types of inquiries, but they're more of a personally based inquiry. How much do you make as a salaried individual? What is the debt on your home? What are the debts you have? Child support? Are you paying mortgages? Do you have income tax, real estate taxes? All those types of things, credit card debt, car loans. Those are more of a personal nature, and therefore those come up more on a residential side. On a commercial side, yes, it's important to find out who you are. They're going to run your credit, but there's a whole other layer. What is the property itself providing for cash flow? What are the expenses in the property? So it's a twofold level of inquiry. Your interest rate will typically be a little bit higher on a commercial transaction.
That's correct.
Than it is in a residential transaction. The term of your loan is going to be a lot different. A lot of lenders are offering 5 or 10-year terms. In fact, most lenders are offering 5 years. And then you have what's called a balloon when it's all done. Your monthly payment may be determined if it's a 30-year payment, but you only have 5 years to make it. So necessarily at the end of that 5-year period, there's going to be a whole lot of money that's due. You may be lucky enough to get a bank that will extend you for an extra 5 years at a slightly higher interest rate, depending upon what market is at the time. But just keep in mind that with a commercial transaction or commercial loan, you are going to have a balloon payment when it's all done. So you need to factor that into where you're going, because you will have to either sell the property, you don't want to do that, or refinance it at a later date. And typically, if you're a good payer and you're on time and you don't have any issues, you haven't been late, no default notices, no violations, most banks will renew you. Most banks want to keep your business. They may require, and this is a part of commercial versus residential, they may require, if it is a bank, that you have deposits at the bank. So your business deposit, they may even require personal deposits coming in. So the bank isn't going to want to lose you, because they don't want to have those funds not on deposit anymore. It will affect their balance sheet.
Make sure you can pay, right?
Precisely. Well, that's another thing. That's a very good point.
Right.
A lot of banks will also require an auto deduction.
Right.
Not so much optional, it's a requirement. Okay?
Right.
So that's something else that you definitely want to keep in mind as well. And as I said before, the rates are a little bit higher. It's a little bit more onerous in terms of knowing you've got that balloon over your head. And a lot of people are used to residential transactions, especially people that are new to the commercial area. They're thinking that, hey, I have a residential loan on my house. It's going to be somewhat similar. It's not going to be somewhat similar. It's very different. What is similar, however, is you will be required to escrow for tax and insurance almost assuredly. But again, the payments are a little bit different. The rate's a little bit different. The other thing is, if you go to the same lender and you have more than one property, the lenders will have a cross-collateral, cross-default provision in there, which simply says that if you are in default on one loan, they can automatically deem you in default of the other. And as soon as you're in default, that's called foreclosure.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I know that when it comes to commercial financing, it's about numbers driven, and also how much you can pay and how much you can cover your expenses, and so it's all about numbers driven, if you will. So yeah. And now, in terms of environmental issues that you just touched on, who performed the Section 21E? Is that the buyer? Is it a seller? I mean,
it's usually never a seller. What happens is this: when you're buying a property, a commercial piece of property, and it's one that would require a 21E. If you're buying a 3-family house, very rarely you're going to have to get a 21E, unless, of course, the neighborhood says that there have been hazardous waste type of properties nearby. There's a paint store near, there's an auto body shop. Those are traditionally those types of things. And your lender may look at that through an appraisal and say, you know what, we're going to require some environmental due diligence, and we're going to require a 21E that gets done. The bank is always going to have their own 21E done regardless. As a buyer, if you want to investigate before, you can hire your own environmental expert, that LSP I referred to earlier, and they can do their own inquiry preliminarily, or they can do a full-blown 21E. Could cost you $2, $3, $4, $5 grand, depending upon how much time that gets done. What a lot of my clients do is they allow the bank to obtain one, because at that point, the bank doesn't want to lend money on something that may not be good. So therefore, you can piggyback on the bank's report, and you can look at that. A lot of times also, if you're buying a gas station or auto service station, the seller will always have had a 21E done at some point because the very nature of the business, they've gotten a loan or they wanted to know, is there an environmental risk?
Right.
So very often, we will ask, as part of the purchase and sale agreement, that the seller provide any surveys that were done, and that the seller provides any title work, and most importantly, any 21E environmental reports that were done previously, so we can kind of run from that point going forward. We've got a starting point that reduces the expense a little bit. And very often, there's a handful of good environmental companies out there that I've found over the years. So what we'll do is we'll get that report, we'll send that report over to the lender. The lender will look at it and say, okay, this is a good solid company. They will do their own investigation of the company, be comfortable with who they are, and then say to them, okay, run it from this point going forward. We will rely upon your reporting because we know how comfortable we are with you. You're a good entity. And so that will save everybody a little bit of money because it's an abbreviated report, but you can rely on the experience of that company and the report they did before because the seller has given it to you and say, here, we will give this to you as part of the transaction, knowing it helps the buyer get their due diligence done quicker. It makes a more solid deal and a speedier close for all parties involved. So it's in the seller's interest to help out in that situation. So sellers rarely are doing their own environmental 21E for a buyer. It is the buyer's responsibility, but very often it's the buyer and the bank that will do it in conjunction to make sure everything is clear. If there is no bank involved, then the buyer will certainly want to do that on his own or her own as well.
So when you talk about the paying for a Section 21E report, so that when the bank is going to do the report, then the fee is going to be rolled into the closing costs?
It all depends, because
is that similar to an appraisal fee?
Yes and no, but commercial, the fees are a little bit higher.
Yeah.
The appraisals are a little bit higher. So typically, and that's a very good question, when you get a commitment letter from a commercial lender, they're usually requiring, not always, but usually, a check up front. It's usually an appraisal fee check and a good faith deposit check. Usually a 1% of the loan amount as the good faith deposit, and there's a basic number they have in mind for their appraisal based upon other appraisals they've done in similar properties. That appraisal fee is non-refundable simply because the appraisal is going to get done. They have to pay for that. So that gets paid up front. The good faith deposit will very often be credited back to you at closing if in fact you close the loan. If you don't, it covers the bank's out-of-pocket expenses and you're done. So the environmental cost will oftentimes be a check up front if it is a property that historically has had a problem. Again, service stations, paint stores, auto body repair shops, painting things that are dry cleaners, the things that typically and historically have had hazardous waste associated with them, the banks will automatically say, hey, wait a second, you're looking to finance a historically problematic type of business or type of property. As a result, we want a check up front in addition to the good faith deposit, in addition to the appraisal fee for the environmental. And just like the appraisal fee, that fee is going to be non-refundable simply because the services are performed. It needs to be paid. But that report, just like the appraisal, will be used as part of the bank's overall assessment of the file and their underwriting to determine do they want to do a loan or not. And that will be something that the buyer will be able to take home, or at least have, when the transaction is complete, or even when the report is done, because they paid for it. Plain and simple.
Right. Just an appraisal report. So
yes, absolutely,
yeah, right.
absolutely.
So when you talk about a report, for example, if the seller has the Section 21E report, now how long would it good until? I mean, if the buyer say, Mr. Seller, can I use your report? As part of the due diligence. If the seller says, yeah, I'm willing to assist. However, they should ask, how old is the report?
Well, it's
because things change.
And that's exactly the point. So if you have a report that was done in 2012, it's a fairly timely report because it's less than 2 years old, or maybe 2 years old. That's However, hazardous risks may have happened from that point going forward.
Right.
So it's a good thing to have because you no longer have to go all the way back in time to double check what was done. You have that starting point going forward. Again, assuming that it's a reputable company that's done it. So you have a starting point which helps you on that part, but you need to make doubly sure that you've identified all risks going forward. And again, DEP, EPA, those are all places where any risks or issues that have arisen have to be reported by law. One is a state entity, one's a federal entity. And that will be something you can do on your own if you're an experienced layperson, or you wish to become an experienced layperson, or you simply engage the services of an LSP to go ahead and make those inquiries. I typically don't do it on my own because there are specific environmental lawyers that are out there. And similarly, there are LSPs that are very experienced. That's what they do for a living.
So when it comes to purchasing commercial properties, I know that we talk about this. Some people ask me, should I use my name to purchase a commercial property, or should I use an LLC or an incorporated to purchase an LLC, which is a business entity? So what would you recommend?
I would never recommend anybody buying anything commercial in their individual name.
Right.
Because as soon as you do that, and there's a problem, anything associated with that name, your home, your car, your bank accounts, some types of investment accounts, are all subject to attachment by the court if in fact you would lose in a lawsuit or some type of pretrial attachment. So the one thing you never ever want to do is take any piece of commercial property in a personal name. You always want to have it in the name of an entity. Right. LLC, corporation. LLCs are in my opinion, the best way to own something now, simply because they're the most manageable. It's the easiest way to do things inside the LLC in terms of changing ownership, changing membership interest, things like that. But the cost is there. The cost $500 to create one at the Secretary of the Commonwealth.
Especially LLC, right?
An LLC and a corporation. And $500 to file an annual report every year for a corp or an LLC to make sure that all your excise taxes have been paid and things like that. But the reward of having that is huge because you no longer have your personal assets at stake.
Right.
Now there are limited times when the courts can come and they can say, okay, we're going to go behind the entity and we're going to go after you personally. And those are very limited circumstances. You really got to be a bad guy, to really have that come down to that. There's another way you can own property. It's called a trust.
Yeah. Right.
But the courts have been increasingly popular in terms of deciding over the years to go behind the trust to go after somebody's personal assets.
Right.
So that's something which, if it's a two-family house, you're owning something, you may want to do that.
Something small.
Something small. Great point.
Yeah.
But when you're getting to larger size things, you're really going to want to have an LLC, and you may even want to get even fancier in having the land owned by an LLC and a business owned by a corporation, and there are tax advantages to that. You would simply consult with your accountant at that time.
Right. And in terms of closing, how long would a commercial loan close? I mean, not commercial loan, commercial property close? Like 60 days, 90 days?
I'm saying you're looking at probably 90 days. A lot of it could depend upon how long it takes for the due diligence to be completed. I've had due diligence situations that have taken 90 to 120 days for the environmental stuff. You may have to go before the zoning board. We mentioned variances earlier. You may want to get a variance. If you're abandoning one usage, you may need to make sure that the neighborhood is okay with the new usage. You have to file notices. That will the planning board allow you to give you a variance or to allow you to do that different type of usage that's there.
Right. And so in terms of buying commercial property, is it more difficult than buying a residential property?
Sometimes. A residential property, a lot of that is your gut. Do you look and you see a property and say, wow, I can see myself, I can see my family here, it's in the right neighborhood.
Imagination, right?
Right, good school systems, close by to transportation, close by to relatives. There are a lot of factors that go into it. Whereas a business property or a commercial property, it all depends upon what you're looking for, almost specifically.
Right.
Yeah, granted, you want to be near, a major intersection, or you want to be near a city or a good town, or things like that. But it's a little bit different. You're targeting. You want to buy a 2 or 3 family building with certain criteria. There are less criteria that go into a commercial property than buying a residential property. Residential, that's really more touch and feel. Whereas a commercial property, does it throw off the necessary cash flow? Will you make your investment, and is it good for liability purposes as well?
So numbers game in commercial.
It is very likely, exactly, a very big numbers game, yes.
Great. Well, with all that being said, I mean, I'd like to thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
For sharing. Before planning to purchase a piece of commercial property, making sure you have performed due diligence on the zoning, and making sure you have consult a commercial real estate attorney who has the experience of guiding you through the entire process, and making sure you understand the real estate law, any environmental issues that would affect the purpose of your business. I want to thank you for being part of the show. Wish to see you next time.